Okay, this week we're doing something a little bit different, and we're going to have a different kind of text than we've had so far at all in the course. Okay, so I want to give you a little bit of background about why we're going to read something from really a totally different tradition, and sort of how it helps us maybe see something that uh, maybe we haven't been able to see with what we've been talking about with ethics. So we spent the last couple weeks studying three major approaches to ethics, right? We got Kant's deontology, Bentham's utilitarianism, and Aristotle's virtue ethics. And all three are different, sometimes like really sharply different, but they all share sort of one assumption. And that's that they all assume that ethical decisions, involves like a thinking agent or a person who makes decisions, who deliberates, who weighs reasons, applies principles or rules, and then makes decisions. And really, everything in Western ethics takes that approach for granted. Takes that approach of there's somebody who will be making their decision using certain criteria or rules or principles and applying it to their behavior. So that's kind of what all the things we read so far have in common, right? Almost without even talking about it, they just assume, yeah, you're going to make a decision. But what if there's a different approach to ethics, which is not so much about clear decision making with rules? And that's why I wanted to read what we're looking at this week, because this reading actually is something that kind of puts that whole picture into question. So what I'm asking you to read are just some snippets of what's called the Zhuangzi or Zhuangzi. It's an ancient Chinese text written by a philosopher who's traditionally called Zhuangzi or Zhuangzi, or sometimes just Zhuangzi himself. Lots of different names, and especially when we get into translations and pronunciations, you can see this set of text called a bunch of different things. Um, but we'll refer to it just as the Zhuangzi. Um, but he lived in the fourth century BCE, so we're going way back. Okay, even a little bit before Aristotle. So what makes this interesting as like a coda or like as a little extra add-on tail to our ethics unit, is that it approaches all these questions of ethics from a totally different direction, and it helps us really see kind of how all those Western approaches may well have one thing in common. Um, so one important thing I want to point out before we go a little further: the reading from the textbook is not the Zhuangzi itself. Okay, it's actually a Western commentator talking about a couple selections from Zhuangzi. Zhuangzi itself is a big collection of stories, of little parables, little sort of metaphorical stories that Zhuangzi uses to make a point, or make a bunch of points, actually. Instead, what we're reading something by a contemporary philosopher named Christian Helmut Wenzel, who's interpreting Zhuangzi. Okay, and he's doing it through the lens of Western debates about free will. So a lot of the terms that he uses are not terms you're going to see in the actual stories themselves. But still, it's in our textbook. It's a useful piece, I think, and so I thought it would be a good thing for us to read. I've also added on the website, our course page, three little stories. One is one that he tells. He quotes pretty much the whole thing, but I've given you a full version of it, along with two other similar stories from Zhuangzi that make a similar point, very similar point. Read both, okay? Read what's on the website. All three of those little stories. There's the bell stand, the horse's hooves, and then the story of how to cut up an ox, which sounds a little gruesome, but it's not about butchering. I mean, it is about butchering, but it's more about the manner in which that butcher goes about things that you really want to read. So a little gross, but it's very traditional. It's a different world. Okay. So, but I want you to read both of them, because I think that Wenzel's point about what Zhuangzi is getting across is really good, and I also think that some of his questions about it are also really good, especially in terms of what we're talking about with ethics. Okay. Um, so with all that in mind, let's get into it just a little bit. So like I said, it is a different kind of text. If you're interested in Chinese philosophy at all, Zhuangzi is definitely someone you want to know. Um, so first, a little bit of background about it. Zhuangzi is one of the most important figures. Can't talk today. In a Chinese philosophical and really religious movement called Taoism. Okay, and it's one of the main philosophical traditions of Southeast Asia itself after Buddhism. Okay. The most famous book in Taoism is not this one. It's actually a book called the Tao Te Ching, or the Book of the Way, by a sort of legendary figure named Lao Tzu, or Lao Tzu. And probably the one book, the one figure you may well have heard of Confucius before, who's in a different tradition called Confucianism. But Taoism, Buddhism, and Confucianism are often seen as the three primary philosophical religious traditions of, especially China, but of Southeast Asia more generally. Um, but Taoism is what we're focusing on, and it's probably the loosest of the three. And I'll kind of show you what I mean by loosest here. But the most famous book, like I said, is the Book of the Way, or the Book of the Tao. That's a very common book that you'll see all over the place. Wouldn't surprise me if many of you have heard of it before, if not read pieces of it. Very often quoted. And it, like the Zhuangzi, it's very much little passages of poetry that kind of tell little anecdotes and little sort of advice giving things. But we're going to be looking at Zhuangzi, who was the second most famous Taoist, because he has some things that may apply directly to ethics. So, um, both books, everything about the way, about the Tao and Taoism, very much a kind of poetic and metaphorical advice giving books. And if there's an easy way to kind of summarize it, what it tries to teach, what Taoism tries to teach, is that nature has a way of doing things, which is actually the way, or the Tao, um, which you should get in tune with. And doing anything against the way, or doing against the Tao, will lead to conflict and trouble and problems, while everything will work well if you follow the way. So what is the way? Well, not to be too flippant about it, but a lot of people read the Tao Te Ching as sort of advising people to just kind of go with the flow. That the idea is that you don't overthink things, and you don't try to force circumstances to fit what you want to happen. In other words, you have to be adaptable to whatever way the world is going. And then if you don't fight against the flow of the world, the flow of nature, the flow of events, the flow of whatever, you'll be just fine. And that everything will ultimately work out in harmony. That's one very common way of sort of interpreting all of Taoism, or what the Tao is all about. So Zhuangzi, he's a philosopher, or some call him a sage, who came after the first Taoist, Lao Tzu, a few hundred years after, and he had a bit more of a kind of humorous streak to him. He tried to teach similar kinds of lessons to the Tao, but he did it through telling lots and lots of little fables and stories about different people who interacted in different ways. So, the first thing that our commentator Wenzel points out is that the Zhuangzi is not a systematic treatise. Okay, it's not at all like anything we've read so far. It doesn't proceed by sort of stating a thesis and giving arguments for them. Instead, it just tells stories. That's really all it is a collection of little stories. There are woodworkers, there are swimmers, there are cooks, there are monkeys and fish, and even river gods and things. There are conversations between philosophers, and including a lot of conversations where Zhuangzi himself appears as a character. And we're not looking at any of the ones where he actually appears. We're looking at ones that he tells about other people. And that approach of sort of telling stories rather than making arguments, it really does matter philosophically. And Wenzel compares Zhuangzi to the work of other philosophers like Ludwig Wittgenstein, who we're not going to read, I don't think, if I remember correctly, we're not going to read in this class. But he always wrote in a way that tried to show how philosophical problems are often sort of better addressed by showing something rather than outright stating it and arguing it. Okay, so there are different forms of philosophy than what we've been talking about so far. Wittgenstein did a lot of fun thought experiments, a lot like if you imagine someone doing philosophy entirely like how Dennett did it in Where Am I? Sort of telling stories to get you to think about something. And that's very much what we're getting here. Rather than a very structured, argumentative kind of idea, we're getting a story. A story where you can see something that in some ways maybe a philosophical argument might prevent you from seeing. Because arguments are about pinning things down and really getting very exact and specific and getting in control of your ideas with definitions and rules. And there may be some things that kind of resist being pinned down. And that's kind of what Zhuangzi is trying to get at, that maybe there's a way to look at ethics that is not about getting super clear on the rules, but it's about something else. So if what you're trying to say goes against having really clear-cut definitions and rules, then you might want to write a different way, and that's exactly what Zhuangzi does. And I keep going back and forth. I learned it as Zhuangzi many years ago. The more common way now, which is I believe more accurate, is to pronounce his name Zhuangzi or Zhuangzi. But I have a hard time unlearning my old ways. But I want you to keep that in mind as we look at, like, why are we reading a couple little stories all of a sudden? Don't rush past them just to get to his commentary when you read them, when he quotes them, or when you read the ones that I put online. The story really is doing the main philosophical work. And like I said, I pulled out a couple other stories I want you to read. We're going to focus mainly on the bell stand story. But I want you to get read all three to get a sense of how Zhuangzi teaches in his writings. Really, what we're trying to do in this course in general is get a taste of a lot of different styles of philosophy. So it was important to me that we read something other than just Western pieces, and we're going to come back to more later on too. So, all right. So, with that being said, and I probably should have put this up here before. But just to say a couple things, yeah. On the left, you see what kind of text this is. And I wanted on the right to show you real quickly a quick little four-way summary of all the ethical theories we've been looking at. So first, if you look at the three, Kant is the first one, who is all about universal duty and rational law. Bentham then was about maximizing consequences. Aristotle was about cultivating virtue and over a lifetime really developing your virtue. Now we're going to have Zhuangzi, who talks about fasting the mind, and we'll talk about what that means, letting go of the self, and then just responding to the situation. And all four ultimately ask one big question, which is, what does ethics ask of us? What does it mean when we ask, how should I live my life? How should I behave in my life? And they all have very different answers to that question, but they also have very different styles of answering that question. And we already talked last week about how Aristotle definitely took less of a sort of focused action by action approach, unlike Kant and Bentham, who were very much about how do I behave in this particular situation. Aristotle was more about something over your entire life. And Zhuangzi is going to be a different kind of thing again, where he's going to say maybe there's an important thing to think about yourself that you need to pull away from those situations rather than really diving in like all three of the others really kind of tell you to do. Okay. So let's talk about the bell stand story and the woodworker, because that's what he is. And by the way, when we say a bell stand, it really is just a stand made to hold a bell. Okay, and that's what he's talking about, building something that looks a little bit like this. Just a very beautiful a stand that would hold a bell that they could use for rituals, for ceremonies, for who knows what, all kinds of things. So I could read the entire story. I'm not gonna, because I'm gonna assume that you read it. But I do want to read this most important passage, to me at least, what I think is the most important passage in the whole story, because it's really the core of what he's trying to get across here. So I'll just read this one part. And this is the bell worker he's made a beautiful bell stand, and somebody says, how do you make such beautiful things? And he tells them. He basically says, I sit down and I meditate and I get rid of myself. And once I've gotten rid of myself completely, then I can go out into the forest and find the perfect pieces of wood. And it's just like the bell stand appears, and I'm just there helping it appear. That's all I'm doing. And that's sort of the heart of the story. But I like this part in particular. He says, after 3 days of sitting there thinking, and there may be some exaggeration here in stories too, right? There's often exaggeration in parables and little stories, but after 3 days, I no longer presume to care about praise or reward. After 7 days, I become so still that I forget I have 4 limbs or a body. Then I enter into the mountain forest, viewing the inborn heavenly nature of the trees. My body arrives at a certain spot, and already I see the completed bell stand there. Okay, so King has carved a bell stand that's so extraordinary, everybody who sees it thinks it must be the work of spirits. And the Marquis of Lu asks him, "What technique did you use?" And King's answer is one of the weirdest things we're going to get in the whole course. And he says, "Before I begin, I fast my mind." And we'll talk about what he means by that. But then he says, after 3 days, I no longer care about praise or reward. After 5 days, I no longer care about honor or disgrace. After 7 days, I forget I even have a body. Then I go out into the forest, I see the tree that already contains the completed bell stand, and I apply my hand to it, and there it is. So, what's going on here? Now, Wenzel calls what happens here a kind of fasting of the mind. And the actual Chinese phrase here is Xinjai, which literally, pretty close, means mind fasting. And what he means, though, is that the woodworker is systematically letting go of everything that makes him a sort of fixed, bounded self or a person. That includes his desire for recognition, like he's a woodcarver. So one of the first things he does is he gets rid of wanting to be a good woodworker and wanting to be known as a good woodworker. He gets rid of his own sense of skill. Notice he doesn't get rid of his skill. He gets rid of his awareness of his skill, his sense of his skill. And eventually, even his awareness of his own body. He gets rid even of his sense of himself. And this is a weird thing to say when we're talking about how do I behave in the world. And the first advice we get here is forget about yourself. Okay, that's odd advice. I hope at least I think it's odd advice. But that emptying out of the self, or forgetting really everything that isn't absolutely necessary for his task, that's what he's trying to do with fasting of the mind, to try and get rid of anything that's going to get in the way of what it is that he's going to try and be doing. And that, oddly enough, even includes himself and his awareness, his sense of control over his own abilities, his own ability to be a good woodworker. But that's not the end of the story. And in fact, that's actually what you do before you actually do the thing you're going to do. That fasting of the mind is sort of preparing yourself to actually do the thing that you want to do. And he even says that preparation, that's actually what makes excellent action possible. And that's the story that he's trying to tell. So Wenzel, our commentator, describes really two things that are happening here. On the one side, there's what he calls a diminished self. So, in other words, no longer holding on to fixed ideas about like who I am, what I deserve, what I can do. It's sort of like actively getting rid of all the things that can get in the way of you actually doing something. That includes worrying whether you're going to succeed or not, focusing on how great it'll feel to achieve something, or being afraid of how bad you'll feel if you don't do something. Things like, to me, it's a lot like what athletes or anyone else might talk about, sort of being in the zone, where you no longer even think about the fact that you're there doing something, you're just doing it. So you can't think about anything other than what's going on right here and right now. It's like if you focus on all that other stuff, on, oh, well, how do I know if I've made the right plan? How do I know if I'm prepared enough? What happens if I mess up? All of those things can get in the way of you actually just doing the thing that you're supposed to do. And, it's very possible that many of you now have heard the phrase mindfulness. That you're supposed to be very mindful when you're doing things. And mindfulness is a similar idea here to Taoist approaches. Was probably directly influenced it in a lot of ways. But mindfulness was about sort of the idea of always taking your mind and bringing it on the here and now. on the thing that you're doing now and not worrying about things that are in the future or in the past, but really just focusing in on what you're doing right here, right now, in this moment. And that if you're always thinking about the future or worrying about the past, you're going to be distracted and you're not going to be able to really do anything. Just like, when it comes time to finally sit down and write a paper, you're never going to get it done if all you do is keep worrying, oh, have I prepared enough? Well, let me research just a little bit more. Where there comes a point, right, where you have to just say, okay, now I'm just going to do what I can do. And it's that moment, it's getting to that moment of just saying, now I'm going to do what I can do, that Zhuangzi is trying to say that's really the most important part of anything that you do. It's clearing your mind of all the things that are not about the actual doing of whatever it is you're going to do. It's getting rid of worry, it's getting rid of preparation, not forgetting preparation, but not making that sort of constant sort of obsession about, oh, do I need to prepare more? Do I need to add this more? But finally getting yourself to the point where you can just do the thing you do. And when you actually do the thing you're supposed to do, in that very act of doing it, you're no longer thinking about whether or not you're going to be successful or not. You're just doing it. And it doesn't mean that you're not conscious. It doesn't mean that you're not aware. It's just that you're no longer thinking about all the other things, like your presence there, or how important it is to you to get this done or to get a grade or something like that. You're just doing the thing, and that's it. So that's where he talks about having a diminished self. That when you're actually doing something and doing it well, you're not thinking about yourself at all. Yourself has kind of disappeared. And all that's happening is the doing. All that's going on is the action. That's that diminished self that Wenzel talks about. So on the other side, he talks about how there's a wider self. And this would be like a self that identifies with what it encounters, that enters into the forest and sees the tree from the inside, that matches the heavenly to the heavenly, is how he puts it there. So the woodworker's not passive. It's not that he's just sort of saying, let go, and just sort of assuming that the universe is going to take over. It's not that either. He's really still doing something. He's going to carve his bell stand. And he's even going to do it incredibly well. But before he can do it incredibly well, he has to get rid of that sense of his self that might get in the way. And the difference, he says, is that he's not imposing himself and his ideas on what he's trying to make. Instead, he's responding to it, almost as if he's just bringing that bell stand out of the tree, as if it was almost already there. And I think athletes are another good example of that. That when you're really in the zone, it's not that you're just sort of totally passive. You may still be trying to win the game, but you're not really thinking about winning. You're not thinking about standing on the stand. Instead, what you're doing is you're in the middle of playing the game. If I know we have a couple soccer players, so you might be sitting there thinking about, oh, where so and so is on the field and all the stuff that you do need to think about when you're in the moment of playing, of positioning and planning ahead for your next move maybe. But you're not thinking about extraneous things. You're not thinking about, oh, am I good enough or am I bad enough or feeling too cocky. Any ideas like that are going to get in the way of you being able just to do the thing you're trying to do. And I know a lot of athletes say that's why they like athletics, because when you're in the middle of the game, you're just thinking about the game. All that other stuff drops away. And that's exactly what Zhuangzi is trying to say here, is that what we need to do is find a way to behave like that more often in everything that we do. Okay, so those two kinds of attitudes of the self. There's the diminished self, where basically you don't get in your own way anymore. But there's also the wider self, that when that part of you that could get in the way of things drops away, you're actually more able to engage with the world around you. That's the other part of mindfulness too. You're more aware of what's actually involved in that moment, in that awareness of that situation. And it makes you probably a better player to get to that point. It makes you a better craftsman if you just focus on the thing that you're making and you're not worried about, what other people will think or something like that. So I hope that that makes sense. Just a couple other things. It's supposed to make things sound effortless, in the sense that you're like, that's what the woodworker says. Is he says, I don't even think about things anymore. It's as if the bell stand just appeared. But a lot of artists will talk about that too. That when they're actually in the zone and making something, it almost feels like the thing itself makes itself. It's they're still active, they're still doing things, but they're not sitting there feeling like I'm putting my plan into action. Rather, I'm helping this thing emerge, and it's the one that's kind of making the decisions, and I'm just the one doing the stuff in the meantime. That's very much what he means by a diminished self, and by the fasting of the mind. Okay? So, these are sort of the breakdowns in the story that he gives of sort of the different stages of it. That you let go of desire for praise, reward, rank, and even salary, or sort of like what's your reward going to be from it. You let go of bigger ideas like honor and disgrace and skill and clumsiness. Again, you don't forget your skill, but you quit worrying about your skill. And day 7, when he says you have a body, that's kind of really a sort of metaphorical way of saying that you get yourself completely out of the way, that you're not involved there at all, even if it's, in the woodworker's case, his body that's going to be doing the working, right? And the result is that you match the heavenly to the heavenly. The result is that things emerge of their own. Things happen. You are in the zone at that point. That's really the result that comes from it. So Wenzel then introduces a distinction between what Zhuangzi is talking about and how Western ethics usually talks about things. And it's the difference between what he calls situations responsiveness and reasons responsiveness. Okay, and I want to talk a little bit about that because I think that's a really interesting way to talk about the difference between Kant, Bentham, and Aristotle on the one hand, and Zhuangzi on the other. That Kant, Bentham, and Aristotle, most Western ethics are focused on reasons responsiveness, whereas Zhuangzi is talking about situations responsiveness. So let's talk about what those are, what those differences are. So he contrasts these two things. Reasons responsiveness is what we have been assuming that ethics requires, all through this unit, where you're presented with a situation, a moral situation where you have to make a decision. You have to act one way or the other, and you deliberate. You identify the relevant reasons. You apply a principle then, especially with Kant and Bentham, that you say, here's a situation where I need to decide X. I will use either the categorical imperative or the utilitarian calculus to decide what action is, and then I will act on that decision. So you're very deliberate. You're deliberating. You're identifying relevant reasons. You're applying a principle. You're making a choice. And even Aristotle, in a sense, gives you the doctrine of the mean and practical wisdom, or at least the doctrine of the mean. Practical wisdom may actually be a little closer to what Zhuangzi is talking about, but we'll talk about that in a second. But all of those are about how a deliberating agent, someone who's going to actively make a decision and force that decision on themselves and on the situation, how they respond to reasons and how they respond to situations. A situation responsiveness, then, is something very different. And it's closer to what happens when you're like swimming in a river and adjusting how you swim continuously to the current, right? If you need to go somewhere when you're swimming, if you're heading that way and all of a sudden the current gets harder, you're going to swim harder. If it eases up a little bit, you can ease up a little bit. And you're not sitting there necessarily measuring, exactly how strong the current is and deciding exactly. You're just sort of reacting. You're just sort of doing it as the situation comes on. That's much more like being in the zone for an athlete, of just responding to situations rather than really sort of, calculating very clearly and deliberately exactly what actions to take. It's also when, I don't know if you've ever been whittling before, but if you've ever, I guess nowadays people don't do that as much, but if you're ever carving a small piece of wood, even if you just were like sitting out somewhere on a camp out and you're carving something, it's real easy to find yourself all of a sudden start sort of stripping a piece of wood along the grain, where you didn't even know that you were doing it, but all of a sudden you find yourself following the grain of the wood, the lines of the wood. And that's because it's how the feel takes you to do it. It's not something you might intentionally do, but it's something with how you just kind of do it. Maybe a better reaction would be if you've heard it all or have studied all about user interaction on cell phones and websites and things like that. It's very much about trying to make it obvious and seamless how you're supposed to use an app or a website, how familiar things are supposed to feel, without ever being conscious of it. So, the best social media, for example, is going to make it very intuitive and easy for you to use. Where you could, first time you ever saw TikTok, you probably just picked up TikTok and were like, yeah, I've seen stuff like this before. I know I can scroll. There's probably a little like button or a heart button. And yeah, I get this. And you don't even think about it. You're just immediately in the process of using the app. That's kind of situations responsiveness, something that's designed in order to help you achieve that kind of goal. That's very much what they're trying to talk about. Something where you're not even aware of having learned something because you just sort of naturally go with it. So this is kind of like, these are not sort of propositional or spelled out in words like a reasons responsiveness approach would be. The swimmer doesn't really deliberate about the current and about exactly how hard to swim. He just responds to it intuitively, continuously, and successfully at the same time. And ultimately, it's that word intuitively, using your intuition, that's most important for situations responsiveness. It's saying that instead of really deliberating about things, you should get out of the way and allow the situation to sort of help guide you at what the best approach to this thing is. So, one thing Wenzel really wants us to notice here, and he talks about this in the piece, is that this kind of situations responsiveness, it's not irrational. Okay, it's not like it's completely unrational or random. At least it's not supposed to be. So the woodworker and even that swimmer we mentioned, they're not acting randomly or sort of impulsively, or just sort of doing like I'm just going to do whatever. It's not really that. They're actually acting with sort of extraordinary skill and precision, but their skill's not a matter of like following rules, maybe not even consciously doing anything. It's a matter of having developed through long practice and even through something like fasting of the mind, the capacity to really be fully present to what the situation requires. So again, it's like how an athlete practices certain movements or drills over and over so that they can perform something without even thinking about it. And people sometimes call that like muscle memory, but that's very much kind of what they're talking about. When you act on muscle memory, everything feels very natural. It can take practice to get to that point, but when you actually do it, it feels very, very natural. So, or it's how musicians might talk about knowing a piece of music so well that they don't even think about what their fingers are doing at all. Like I play guitar, and when I'm really having fun playing guitar, I'm not thinking about exactly how my fingers are moving. I'm just playing the music, but my fingers are doing complicated stuff that I really had to learn at one point. But when I'm really finally doing it for real, I'm not thinking about that stuff. I'm just playing the music, even if it's like super, super complicated. So, Wenzel's phrase for what results is control without control. And the Zhuangzi's own phrase for that is called wei wu wei, or doing without doing. And that sounds kind of paradoxical, but the woodworker's story, I think it shows us what it means, where he is doing something. He's definitely doing something, making something. But it's not the kind of doing that imposes a plan on sort of resistant material, that you have to force your will onto something. Instead, it's a kind of doing that flows out of the situation itself, where he's not going to go just pick any tree and force that tree to look like the bell stand. He's going to go out into the forest, and the one that actually fits the shape that he wants, that's the one that's going to call to him. The one that's going to most easily translate into that idea that he's trying to bring about. That's what he's trying to pull out. Okay, so far, this actually may sound kind of appealing, maybe even attractive, because it's very natural, it's very mindful, it seems very peaceful in a lot of ways. And I think there is something genuinely important in this idea. But I also like that Wenzel is honest enough to really press a sort of difficult question, which is, does this idea really work for ethics? It works for all kinds of situations like art or craftsmanship or athletics, like we talked about. But does it work for ethics? Does it work for situations where the outcome can go a couple different ways and it really matters what we do? So, um, so here's kind of the problem. When the woodworker fasts his mind and enters the forest, the criteria of success of like what it counts to actually build the bell stand are built into the situation. Like the grain of the wood tells him where to cut, the structure of the material guides his hand. There's a fact of the matter about what excellent carving is going to look like, and the skilled craftsman can access it through practice and attunement. The same thing with the story that I had you read about the ox butcher, who talks about how he's done it so much he knows exactly how to cut, how to take the meat apart without ever even dulling his knife, because he's just done it so much and he doesn't even think about himself, and he just knows exactly where to do it. It's literally second nature. Same with the story about the horses, about somebody who has tried to force the horses to go against their nature, whereas if you just let them be, they're fine. Well, that's all great when we're talking about situations of just letting things be what they naturally are. Ethics, though, are often about situations where both ways make a difference, and both ways are maybe not so much natural as things that we actually have to choose from. So, what are the criteria for success in a moral dilemma? If criteria for success in sort of craftsman situations or creative situations are sort of built into the process, what happens in a moral dilemma? So, like, if you're deciding whether to tell a painful truth to a friend, maybe, or whether to break a rule to prevent a harm, or how to treat someone who has wronged you, there's no grain in the wood, as it were. There's no sort of pattern that's there. There's no current to follow. The situation itself doesn't just sort of reveal what you should do in the way that the tree revealed the completed bell stand to King, right? To King the woodworker. So Wenzel cites a sharp criticism from a philosopher named Chad Henson, who argues that the Zhuangzi essentially leaves us with nothing to say about genuine moral evil. Hansen kind of argues that, on Zhuangzi's view, all you could say about, say, the rise of Hitler and Nazi Germany is that Hitler happened. Like, it's not really going to tell you whether that was right or wrong. It's not going to tell you if genocide was wrong. Attunement to the situation of like really sort of letting things happen that are naturally going to happen, that's not going to give you the concept of like equal human dignity. So Wenzel doesn't think that this criticism is necessarily fatal, but he takes it seriously, and I think it's something we should take seriously too. He notes that Kant's categorical imperative, for as rigid as it may be, at least gives you guidelines for reflection on what principles you should universalize and which ones you shouldn't, right? Aristotle's virtue ethics, for all its sort of being very sensitive to context, it at least tells you that justice and courage are real, genuine human excellences that you can cultivate and you can defend, is like why they're good. Zhuangzi offers something a little more elusive, which is a trust in what's natural and a sort of sensitivity to situations, and also kind of a freedom from narrow-mindedness. But whether that's maybe enough for genuine morality is maybe a different question, maybe a harder question in lots of ways. So, I just want to throw that out there because I think it's an important potential criticism of Zhuangzi, which is something that shows maybe what some of the Western approaches at least confront directly. I'm not saying which one is better or worse, and I think there are probably in the end there are different situations where each one of these applies in different ways, better ways than others. But I think it is a fair criticism to bring up. So I want to close by connecting this week's reading to where we've been all unit, just a little bit more. And so I want to show you again real quick a quick little summary of all four ethical theories we've looked at. with Kant, Bentham, Aristotle, and Zhuangzi. And these are going to be in the PowerPoint slides for this video, so you can download this slide. It's a good, just single review slide to have. Goes over kind of what we've said the core sort of advices of the ethical theory and where they seem to be strong and where they seem to be weak. You may have different opinions or different approaches, but these are the ones that we've been emphasizing so far. I also, and I'll leave that up for just a second. Like I said, it's going to be there for you to download, so you'll be able to get that off the course. But I want to go on to a little bit more about just a few things about the one and the many, because really every Western theory we've looked at so far assumes that the moral agent is like a unified self or a one who reasons and decides. And Zhuangzi literally dissolves that self, right? The diminished self has no fixed identity. That wider self is distributed across the whole interaction between the agent and the environment. And in this sense, Zhuangzi is in some ways the most radical pluralist that we've read so far. Not just about ethics, but about what a person is. He almost says that a person is themselves in their interaction with their whole environment. But at the same time, Zhuangzi points toward a different kind of unity, and that's the harmony of the whole situation. The woodworker and the wood, the swimmer and the water, they're all acting as one all at the same time. But that's a very different kind of one from Descartes' cogito or Kant's autonomous rational agent, who are sort of very clear, discrete things right here that are very certain about certain aspects of themselves. In terms of the hedgehog and the fox, Zhuangzi looks like kind of the ultimate fox, maybe, because he has no single organizing principle, right? No categorical imperative, no doctrine of the mean. He's got stories. And the stories actually kind of show a lot of different things depending on the situation. Wenzel, though, suggests that underlying all of them is something like a single message, which is let go of fixation. Okay, be responsive to transformation. And in that sense, maybe Zhuangzi is a hedgehog after all, just maybe an unusual one, if there is sort of one lesson underneath everything. So in terms of the unit as a whole, I do want you to hold all four of them, Kant, Bentham, Aristotle, and Zhuangzi, together in your mind as like four different answers to the question of what ethics asks of all of us. Kant says you should be a rational legislator of universal law. Bentham says be a careful calculator of consequences for everyone. Aristotle says be the kind of person whose character makes right action natural. And then Zhuangzi says fast your mind, empty yourself, and let the situation show you what to do. So each of these captures, I think, something true. And each of them pressed hard enough also runs into difficulty. So that tension is, I think, one of the interesting things about ethical theories, and why studying them can really help you sort of see a lot of variety of approaches and maybe help you understand yourself why it is you act in certain ways and what are maybe better ways to act in certain other ways. So I hope that helps with getting all four of these different ideas a little summarized just a little bit. So a wide variety of things in this unit, but that's what we're going to have for ethics this term. There are many other ethical theories, so if you've enjoyed or been interested in ethics, there is a whole world of ethics, and you can even take an ethics course that will talk about these and many other ethical theories in a lot more detail. So consider that. But in the meantime, if you have any questions about any of these, let me know, and I will put up a review for the test here shortly. All right. Thanks, guys.